1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 to 5 reading. The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being ensamples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd shall appear, ye shall receive a crown of glory, and that fadeth not away. Likewise, ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you, be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble. May God bless the reading of His Word. Now let's start with question number 1, all right? So these questions are to help guide us along as we study. Now, should we appoint someone to be a pastor because he volunteers? Now, last week we mentioned, right? There's no one, and we say, well, we should not say there's no one. Just appoint a woman because she can preach. She's very vocal. She's very articulate. Now, but should we just then, at that point of time, maybe one of you step up and say, so we learned that. I'll step up. I'll volunteer, all right, to go to FEBC to study and then come back and be the pastor. Because last week you said, right, man, please understand is your role. Don't abscond your role, all right? So we begin at the back there, all right? Maybe I begin at the back here. Aaron, haven't seen you for a long time. Welcome back again. Very glad you can join us after your trip. Now, Aaron, should we just appoint anyone who volunteers and say, I will step up to be a pastor? No. It's a calling, all right? All right, you gave the answer, so no. All right, why? Because it's a calling. Now, remember we read in Acts, the Apostle Paul says, the Holy Spirit which appointed you, all right? So it's appointment of God, right? The role of a pastor is an appointment of God. The Holy Spirit appoints. So to appoint, He calls, all right? There is a call to the full-time ministry. So it is not something that we volunteer and say, well, I want to step up because the church needs a man to step up to these roles, right? So we don't. That is very straightforward. We should not succumb to the fear. Right now you say, well, Pastor, you're not getting any younger, and then, what happens if you die soon or suddenly something happens to you? Then, no, shouldn't we begin to train someone up, kind of thing? Well, it is first and foremost a calling, all right? So we must not succumb to fear. Now, remember when the church didn't have a pastor here in BPCWA, right? The church didn't have a pastor. Well, those of you who are here for a long time, maybe like Elim, all right? Elim, you were here for quite long, right? You pretty much born and grew up here. Now, Elim, then when the church was going through a lot of turmoil and all, and they were trying to look for a pastor, have you heard of me? Do you know that I was born in 1964, right? It's amazing. I hear people born in 2020 something. It's like, that's alien to me. Right? I was born so long ago, but did you hear about me? No. Did you hear that there was someone called Joseph Poon called and studying in FEBC? No. Right? Now my point is this. Just because we don't know doesn't mean that God is not preparing a man. All right? So we don't just go ahead and do what we want to do. All right? So learn to trust God, learn to pray, and wait upon the Lord, and it must be a calling. It must be a calling. Now, so that's the first question. That's easy. Now, second one is, if you understand this question, I give you 100 marks because it's totally a garble, right? I changed the question a few times, so it doesn't make sense at all. I forgot to edit it. Now, simply what I'm trying to ask. Now, should we appoint a woman to preach if she's the best person? All right? Should we appoint a woman to preach if she's the best person? Now, and you know the answer, all right? But the question is this. Should we do so to take care of things temporarily? Just temporarily. Because it's a common practice and a common notion. Well, since there is no one called, all right? And then I think the best thing to do is, since this woman is very spiritual, very mature, articulate, all right? People seem to respond to her. Now, we understand that in the long term, it should be a man. But this is a temporary situation. All right, this is a temporary situation. So let us just appoint her temporarily. And we acknowledge it's temporary. All right, and she acknowledges it's temporary as well. Now, should we go ahead and do that? Well, where was I at? Where did I start? On the back, right? So I moved to JB. No, JB I asked earlier, so I can skip. Maybe Ajax. You want to try, Ajax? You understand the question? No, you don't even want to try. All right, Mark, you want to try?
I think it's temporary, and notice that, don't always pastor everything, and when they find a new pastor, then she'll just give all the roles to him. I think he said that would be fine.
All right. So we seem to have the impression, and maybe I gave you the impression as well, that if it is temporary, it's fine. As long as the woman knows it's temporary, she's ready to relinquish it, and the man knows this is temporary, the church knows it's temporary. So, yeah, I think let's go ahead and do that. Okay, Caleb, what do you think? Cornelius. You know, this long-term COVID thing is my excuse, right, Cornelius?
From what you said last week, I think it's okay.
I think it's okay. Okay. I said that very specifically. Not really, but I gave the impression. Okay, last person, maybe here. Okay, I skipped that too, so I asked all of you already. Yeah, have I asked you? No. Okay, yes, Ryan.
I think it was that you also specifically maybe said in a temporary situation when no other avenues are possible.
Very good. All right, so make sure you understand what I said. Where there are no other avenues possible. All right, no other avenues possible. For example, deep in the jungle, right? Kind of situation, or you're so far in some place where it's difficult to get to, and there are no other avenues possible. All right, so my point is this. We should not jump to that until we have exhausted, I think I said that word, exhausted all possible avenues, all right? It should not be the first thing that comes to our mind. Now the question is, what are the possible avenues? All right, Ashna, what are possible avenues? Say again? Co-op a pastor. Invite a pastor to come. All right, so you invite a pastor, but none responded, all right? And Ashna is still the best person to step up to temporarily preach and teach, all right? What's the next thing to exhaust? Nicole, what will you think of? The men in the church to step up. The men in the church to step up, but you know, if a man is not trained, he can actually teach you the wrong thing, correct? So that is not a good avenue to pursue. All right, no good avenue. All right, maybe I'll move to the back. Caleb, what would you do? Imagine it happened to this next Sunday. This church. Give up. Okay, so you're like, brother. Okay, I asked Elim already. Ella, you want to try? What would you do in a situation like that?
I would, maybe like other churches in your denomination, you can ask if they have like any other pastors that could come and like preach in your church every week.
Yep, right. So that avenue was exhausted too. And then they said, oh no, everybody's so tired. And anyway, you are so far down north or south, it's impossible for us to do that.
Well, I wasn't here last week, so I don't know what you said about the whole like women preaching temporarily. But I guess if that's what you think, then that would be the answer, that a woman would step into temporarily.
Temporarily. All right. So now the question is that the first thing we jump to? All right. So that is the difficult part. No, right? No. So what are the possible solutions? Now, what did you do? What did I do when I was in Singapore? We used video streaming, right? Video streaming, all right? So video streaming today with the technology, it presents a whole new way of taking care of a church when there is absolutely none. We do not need to resort immediately to have a model that is even temporary against what God would rather have, right? So you can, when it comes to the preaching part, all right, we can always live stream. So do not jump to the first the first thing say, well, it's temporary, and in the past temporary, they use women, so let's do that. Suddenly, there are actually very easy avenues, right? So video sermons, live streaming, and so on. So technology helps, all right? Unless you say that we can't even have a satellite connection, right? Well, and if that's really the situation, maybe that would be really the only resort, right? But we should not jump immediately to that. Right? Pray for wisdom, and this is an avenue that we can easily use. Okay? So exhaust that avenue, all right? That's easily available today. Now, so question number 2, just to make sure that becomes clearer. Question number 3. All right, so now we move to, maybe there are several other things also that came up that someone asked. All right, so Ichung asked, now in some situations, in some churches, they actually they disagree that women should lead and preach and teach, right? But they say it's okay if it's a husband and wife team, right? Most likely because of the situation of, let's turn to Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18. All right, now let us read from verses 24 to 26. All right, 24 to 26 reading. And a certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. And he began to speak boldly in the synagogues. When Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. So he said, look, here we have a husband and wife team, all right? So there is a scriptural basis for that, scriptural basis for doing husband and wife team, teaching, preaching together, all right? So what do you think, Isaac? If mostly the husband, right? How mostly? Let me see. How many percent? So it becomes difficult, right? Mostly is how many percent? 95%. Oh, when he leaves out something, the wife can add in. Okay. All right. Do you think this is what happened in scriptures? All right. Julius, you want to try? I know it's very difficult. All right. I excuse you for your age. Matthew, you're always very creative. Is this scriptural basis for having husband and wife team preaching and teaching in church? Okay, while you muse. Jedida? No, why? All right, number 1. Now let's look at scriptures. Let's look at scriptures. Now, verse 26, they took him unto them. All right, they took him unto them, meaning to say they pulled him aside privately, took him unto them, and they expounded. All right, so number 1, it's not a public church thing that is preaching and teaching. All right, so it's private. Now, not only that, what else? Jesse, what else do you think does not support that notion?
I don't think it was, the context, it wasn't a teaching, it was more of a correction.
Very good. The context was more correction rather than teaching. All right, having a series, ongoing, preaching, teaching together. All right, so it was more a correction and private. All right. Yeah, so these are yes. All right, so these are some reasons why we believe that this passage is not God sanctioning and encouraging husband and wife preaching and teaching in church, standing up on an ongoing basis. This is a private correction. That is all. Just like when sometimes these things happen, your dad and your mom may say, oh, you know, correct someone who actually said something that is unbiblical, wrong in church, kind of thing, right? It is not. Then does it mean that the moment they do that, I can say, wow, then they come up and preach and teach a series and ongoing. Okay? So that. Now remember, it's spiritual authority, all right? Spiritual authority. And it may be, I say, maybe 5%, but if that 5% is an exercise of clear spiritual authority, then it also becomes a problem, right? So these are some things that when we face, we have to be ready to know how to respond. Okay? Now, all right, so, for example, in the case of our church choir, all right, our church choir, when there is the part where there is exhortation, when there's exhortation, all right, I will do the exhortation, correct? But it doesn't mean that I have to teach how to sing every note, teach you how to sing the notes, and all that. That's a factual thing. That's not a spiritual exhortation, correct? So these are things that we should make sure that we follow God's model, and when we do so, the Lord will bless. Now, let us then move to 1 Peter and continue in the next verse, all right? So we went through some of these aspects of the church model quite thoroughly. Now we move to verse 3, all right? Verse 3. Now let us just read verse 3 and 4 together, verses 3 and 4, reading. Neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd shall appear, ye shall receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away. Now, here are the instructions to the pastors and the elders. So, we have to understand as worshippers what are their roles, and you've got to be able to discern if they are actually fulfilling their roles in the church, all right? So, we have to learn that as well. It's a warning to pastors and elders, and also to build up understanding in the congregation. How do I choose a church? What should the church pastor and the elder be like? Are they fulfilling what God expects? Now, here, I ask question number 3. Now, what does God's heritage mean? We have to understand this first in order to be able to have a good grasp, all right, of what God expects. What is God's heritage? And what are lessons for the elders, as well as you, the congregation, as God's sheep, right? So, what is God's heritage? Now, maybe just guess, all right? Faith, guess. What is God's heritage? What does it mean? The pastors and the elders are to look after God's heritage and not lord over God's heritage.
Well, a heritage in itself is like where you come from or your background. So I would guess that it's his background.
All right, heritage. Oh, so you use it as in your background. What's your heritage? All right, your background. Right, that's one aspect of English word heritage. But here, when God's heritage, where you come from, it could be applied that where do you come from? I am a child of God, right? I'm God's heritage. In other words, I belong to God. God is my father, right? That's my heritage in that sense. Yes. And then when you think about that, what exactly do you think? What is God's heritage? What will come to your mind? God's people, okay. It's quite accurate because now this word heritage in other parts of the Bible, the Greek word, is also translated to inheritance, which refers to God's inheritance. We are God's inheritance. We are God's people, right? We belong to God. What else? Veronica, want to try? When you think we are God's heritage, what does it mean? And the pastors and the elders are not supposed to lord over God's heritage. What's God's heritage? Say again? I can't hear you, sorry. We serve Him. The implication will come, we serve Him. Now, heritage means God's property. God's heritage means God's property. Now, in the Greek word, it refers to property. Now, it's also often translated as lot, L-O-T. What's my lot? What belongs to me, all right? So this word refers to God's property, belonging to God, God's possession. So when you read in the Bible, God's heritage, we are God's heritage, it means we are the possession of God. God possesses us. We belong to God. All right? Now, to understand this is important so that we know, well, what the pastors and elders know, what they must be, what does it mean to you as well. All right? Now, it also means a legal belonging. All right? A legal belonging. That is why it's also translated as inheritance. Inheritance. All right? It legally belongs to someone. All right? This is my heritage. It belongs to me legally, allotted to me. All right? So there is a legal aspect to it as well. Now, when we understand that, is very, very encouraging. Why? You are God's heritage means I legally belong to God. Now, if you legally belong to God, then nothing can break that bond, correct? Because it's a legal belonging. All right? That is why God promises, I will never leave you or forsake you. And God says, nothing can separate me from you. All right? Nothing. It's a legal belonging. Now, of course, then we must begin to think about its implications. All right? One of it, Veronica says, if I belong to God and I'm His possession, then He is God, then I must serve Him. Right? I must serve Him. So that's one of the implications. I must serve Him. I belong to Him. Now, Phoebe, what else will come to your mind when you think of I am God's heritage? Say again. You must be brave. You must pray.
You must be praised.
Okay, spell it out.
He must be praised.
He must be praised. All right, you must be. All right, sorry. All right, can temporarily remove the mask. He must be praised. We belong to Him. He is our owner. All right, He owns us, and we therefore should serve Him. We should praise Him. All right, good. Now, actually, why? Maybe I ask, Abigail, why are we God's heritage?
Because Jesus died on the cross to save us from our sins, and now we're God's children.
Very good. We are God's heritage because, now all this, understand all these facts, because there's a reason why God says, please don't lord over my heritage, all right? Please don't lord over my heritage. Now, so heritage, being God's heritage, the reason why we are God's heritage, is because Jesus Christ shed His blood on the cross and He purchased us with His precious blood, all right? He redeemed us. The Bible uses legal terms, redeem, meaning to say something is given for redemption, to redeem you, and now you belong to the person who redeemed you, all right? So all these are legal terms. So Jesus Christ redeemed us, so we belong to Him. We are God's heritage because He purchased us with His precious blood. And that is why we must serve Him, because, well, He purchased us for His purpose, right? Now, what else should come to our mind? Well, then with that, all right, maybe with that, we can begin to then, well, learn the lessons. Now, God says, the church, the people in the church, they are my heritage. So, He said, do not lord over them. Do not lord over them. What do you think is the warning to pastors and elders? What do you think is the warning to pastors and elders? You want to try next? What's the learning? Not sure, all right. It's okay. Abigail, you want to try? You are God's heritage, then what must pastor remember? That you must be grateful for that. All right, that's you. But we must therefore remember the pastors and the elders must always see the congregation as the congregation that belongs to God. It's not my congregation. All right? I should never stand here and tell people, you know, my congregation. All right? We should never use such terms. It's God's congregation, God's flock. So God reminds people of that. Now, how do you feel if now you belong to your dad, right? And then someone comes and keeps saying, well, my child, my child. And the father said, no, he's not your child. I'm the one who brought up the child. I'm the one who looked after the child. I'm the one who provided for the child. I'm the father, right? So the first thing that pastor and elders must learn is the church belongs to God. Remember King Saul. Now, why was King Saul set aside by God? Now, you notice that very often King Saul would say, my people. My. His idea is Israel was his, my nation, my, all right? My people, and so on, right? So he was one leader that did not understand Israel is God's people, all right? So that's one thing. Now, another thing that pastors and elders must always remember, because you are God's heritage, then they must take care of you for God. They must take care of you for God. All right? God make them overseers in verse 2. So they must care for the congregation spiritually. Now then, the next thing that pastors and elders must remember, because the congregation, the sheep, belongs to God, God died for them, then their pastors and elders are accountable to God, accountable to the owner for what he does or fails to do, right? For the congregation, accountable to God. Now, what else must we learn about that? Well, maybe I ask this. Come here. Nicole. Jesus Christ redeemed you, right? So what must pastors and elders remember when they think Jesus Christ redeemed you, when it comes to lordship? Right, I know my question is quite cryptic. Well, we must remember that Jesus Christ died for the sheep, not me, not the elder. It's Jesus Christ that died for you all, right? Jesus Christ redeemed you with his precious blood. No matter how hard I work to feed you with the word, to take care of the church, it's nothing compared to Jesus Christ who gave his life to save you, correct? Now, once the pastor and the elders remember that, what must they then always do? Hopefully that's a bit easier. What must they always do? Knowing that you all are purchased by the blood of Jesus Christ, he redeemed you all, you belong to him, all right? Everything that you have is because of him. Then, as I take care of you all, what must my aim be? What must my purpose be? Say again? To feed you spiritually. Yes. In specifically, especially what way? Next, Janelle.
Direct the congregation.
Very good. Direct the congregation to him. All right? Direct the congregation to God. The pastors and the elders must always turn people, the church, to Christ, to God, the Father, who sent his Son to die for us. So, the pastors and the elders must never lead in a way that says, well, listen to me, what I tell you, unless it is from the Word of God, right? They must always feel, they must always remember, and they must always understand. When I hear something, when I do something, I am doing for Christ. This is about Christ. This is never about, well, pastor worked so hard for us, and therefore let us better listen to him. Well, we should be grateful, all right, to our parents, grateful to people who help us. But ultimately, people must always, pastors and elders must never say, you know how hard I work for the church? You know who rescued the church? I'm the one who did all these things. You better be grateful to me. You better follow me. Never, all right, never. So this is what the elders must always remember, the elders and the pastors. Now this is how, and the last one. Now, can you please keep a bookmark here and turn to Acts chapter 20, Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20. Now here is the Apostle Paul giving the instructions to the pastors and the elders. Let's read from verses 28 to 30. 28 to 30 reading. Take heed, therefore, unto yourselves, and to all the flock over which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he hath purchased with his own blood. For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things, to draw away disciples after them. Now here is what the pastors and elders were told to do. Look at verse 28. Now it says, God the Holy Spirit have made you overseers to feed the church of God. Overseers, as we've studied, it is to take care of, all right? To inspect, to care for. The word feed here is not just about feeding with the word, all right? It is like nursing, all right? Caring for. Now, and included in this is verse 29, the warning. There will be grievous wolves that enter among the pastors and elders, not sparing the flock. So there will be false teachers, like today. There will be false teachings. There will be men that will come in to not spare the flock. Means, well, they will devour the flock, all right? Teaching them false doctrines. Now, for their own purpose, for example, look at verse 30. And say, even among yourselves, the warning, even within the church, right? Not just from those coming from outside. Men will arise, speaking perverse things. Now, to draw disciples after them. To draw disciples after them. To turn the church and people into their followers. Now, look at verse 28. It says, which he purchased with his own blood. Now, so we learned earlier on, Christ purchased you with his own blood. The church leaders are to point you to him, never to ourselves. And the other thing is, from here we learn we are also to protect the flock of God from false teachings, right? From errors. That is why we must also point out errors. Otherwise, we can protect you, right? You go to school, you will go to, you'll be among your friends, and you hear things that may be unbiblical, and you don't know that it's unbiblical, right? So here is also the responsibility to protect, all right? Protect. Now then, maybe the question for yourself, what should you realize since you are the flock of God? So we've spoken about what the pastors and the elders must always realize, must always remember, all right? Maybe I stop here for a while. Now, if one day there are leaders in the church, all right, that keeps trying to make you feel make you feel that you should be grateful to them, you should buy things for them, you should treat them nice, all right, and so on, and keeps making you feel obligated to them, right, physically with things and all that. Look at chapter 5 of 1 Peter. Chapter 5 of 1 Peter. Then you know these people are what God describes here. Chapter 5, verse 2. Chapter 5, verse 2. All right? They are serving for filthy lucre, not of a ready mind. All right? So they are serving for their own benefit. So now, you are the flock. What do you feel? How should you now respond, knowing that you are the heritage of God? How should you respond? Jennifer, how should we respond? What must you always remember about the church? Very good, right? Very simple. That the church belongs to God. Now, when you remember that the church belongs to God, we are all God's heritage. The church belongs to God. Then Cornelius, what must we remember? If the church belongs to God, we are God's heritage, the church belongs to God, then how should we respond? Well, the first thing is we then should use what we have, because we belong to God and everything we have belongs to God, what we have for God, all right? For example, to use our abilities, our resources, our time to serve the living God, all right? That the work of God may forward, for example, all right? Because we are the heritage of God. Now, what else must you remember? If the church belongs to God, Ryan, then when the church decides not to do something, decide to do something or not to do something, and displeases you, your personal preference, how should you think?
Well, because ultimately we are followers of God, so unless the personal preference is a biblical one, but if it's if what the church is doing is biblical, then we should set it aside for the forwarding of God's word.
All right? Because the church, we as a flock, heritage of God, belongs to God, then we exist for God's purpose, correct? We exist for God's purpose. Now, that being so, then when the church decides on something and you see that is for the betterment of God's kingdom, that is for the betterment of the spiritual state and growth of God's people, which belongs to God, then we must put aside our personal preferences. Right? So when we say we are the heritage of God, it is not to feel that, wow, we are so special. All right? It's to be humble and realize that then therefore we must put aside our preferences for the forwarding of God's kingdom and God's work. Right? God did not purchase the church with His blood to serve us, but to serve His purpose. All right? So please remember that. Now then, look at what else? Then the church exists to please who? Right? That's an easy one. Noah. The church exists to please who? Please God, not you. Right? So once you begin to understand, look at chapter 5 of 1 Peter, verse 3. Neither being lords over God's heritage. So God is reminding the pastors and the elders, the flock do not exist to please you. They are my heritage. Then the flock must remember, all right, we don't exist, all right, to please ourselves, and the church don't exist to please us. Just like the pastor and the elder must remember, we are not here to get you to please the pastor and the elder, but to please God. The congregation must also remember, we are not here to please ourselves. The church is here to please God, all right? Now, this is an important understanding. When God tells the pastors not to be lords over God's heritage, it's a reminder to both parties, all right? To both parties. Now, I think those are some of the key things that will come to my mind. I'll briefly mention, now we are stewards. We are not owners of the church. We are stewards, not owners of the church. The church is God's heritage. The people of God are God's heritage, right? So, we are stewards. The things that we have in the church is meant for God's use, meant for forwarding God's kingdom's work. The money, all right, the finances, the resources are meant for that. And we are stewards, right, for God. So you cannot say, well, since the church has money, why don't the church pay for my education, pay for my car, pay for my this, my that, and my this, my that, right? They are meant for God's use, all right? We are just stewards. And one of you have already mentioned our abilities, our time and all also. We are to be stewards of them for God. All right, now ultimately together, right? Together, and I hope you take note of this. When God says, well, the flock, in other words, the congregation, the church is my heritage. Now together, we must remember the church's model, the church's message, the church's music, the church's methods must always be consistent with God's words and God's principle. Because the church belongs to God, all right? So its model, which we spoke about, right? God's model is that the men are supposed to be in these roles, not the women. This is just God's model. This is God's church. God dictates, not society, not us, not our wisdom. So God's model. What is God's message? All right? It is not a watered-down message to please men. God's message is that He is supreme, and that men exist to serve Him, love Him, not the other way around, not the health and wealth gospel. The church's music, all right, must be differentiated from the world, all right? Not like the world. That's why the church is called church. The Greek word is ekklesia. Ekklesia is the Greek word. Ek is exit, out. Ecclesia has to do with called. So church simply means called out ones. The heritage of God are the called out ones. We are called out from where? Called out from the world. To be different from the world, not strangely different, right? To be a holy witness, all right? So it's music, it's methods. How we do things must be biblical, honest, all right? With integrity, all right? So all this are what we together should learn from this word. The congregation is God's heritage. Now let's move to then the next question, all right? The next question quickly. Now here we may find a bit of a dilemma when we read, but of course it's easily resolved when we understand God's word. Now how do we explain verse 3, right? Verse 3 says, the warning to the pastors and the elders, neither as being lords over God's heritage. But yet, in the verse before that, right? In the verse before that, look at verse 2. God tells us, feed the flock of God, which is among you, taking the oversight. Now, on one hand, in verse 2, God says, take oversight. And we studied the word oversight. It's literally mean to preside over, to have an overview, to have authority over, to rule. All right? To inspect carefully, and to lead and to rule, all right? So that's oversight. That's the meaning of oversight from the word bishop, where we get the English word bishop, all right? Oversight. So now if on one hand God says, take authority and rule, all right? On the other hand say, but yet you cannot be lords. Lords are rulers, right? You cannot rule. Now, so how do you understand this? Understanding God's heritage, which as we spend some time on, helps us to understand this so-called apparent contradiction, right? One hand say take authority, the other hand say don't take authority. But the key word is look at verse 3, verse 2, the flock of God. And then God's heritage in verse 3. So that's the key to helping us understand. Now how do you explain, or how would you think? Because it's important, the next question I will ask, why do you think this is important to differentiate? Wait, where do I stop? Where did I stop? Where? Oh, okay, Justin. How do you differentiate this? Because the problem can be this. The church makes a direction and they say, look, the pastors and elders are lording over us. Right? But yet, God says, take authority. So how would you explain if someone comes up to you, Justin, one day say, you see, pastor and the elder, they make this decision for the church to go in this direction. You see, they're telling us what to do. They're like lording over us. The Bible said they shouldn't lord over us. And look at church camp, right? They set rules in church camp, like lords. So how will you explain? You agree? Okay.
He used the word feed the flock, which is to shepherd the flock. And it's more to do so with spiritual matters based on spiritual principles and not of their own principles.
Okay.
It's not really to like dictate or like it's not really like ruling over them with like an iron rod, but more so to spiritually and guide them and
all right, not ruling over like iron rod, and then and they are to feed the flock, means they are to care for them spiritually. All right, okay. Now at the church camp, we said lights off at what time is it? 10 o'clock, 10:30. I forget. 10:30. All right. I have no lights off because I have to prepare messages. I don't sleep till 4 a.m. All right, lights off at 10:30. And that is like iron rod, you know. And then we assign Shelley leads to say, knock on your door, lights off, lights off.
it's for the spiritual good.
Spiritual good. Why?
It's to prepare them for the next day.
So the next day they won't be tired. All right. Now, so now one of the things that we have to remember is the difference is when it is for a spiritual good. Now, when it's for spiritual good, are they lording over you, as in pointing you to them, telling you to do what they want to do for their own benefit? No, right? So it's for a spiritual purpose. So we must be able to differentiate. Now, what's the difference? Then what about lord? We should not lord over them. Want to try, Mark?
You mean like,
What's the difference between don't lord over them, but at the same time take authority over them? What's the difference?
I guess maybe it's like acknowledging that the Lord is God, but with authority, it's more like guiding them towards God. So like teaching them God's principles, and obviously the Bible, which is authority technically because you're in a position of leadership to lead them towards God, but not as the Lord, because you acknowledge that that is God.
Right, very good, all right? So now, here when God says, don't lord over them, now notice that in verse 3, neither being lords over God's heritage. Now, remember we say one of the key things to remember, God's heritage means belongs to God, and the pastors must turn and point them to God, correct? Point them to God. So when God said, neither being lords over their heritage, don't point them to yourself, like as if you are their Lord. All right? In other words, lording over God's heritage, the negative principle, the negative connotation means this. You make someone do what you, the pastor and the elder make people do what they want for their own benefits. They are the Lord's, not Christ. All right? So it's for their own benefit, for their own pleasure. That is why, look at verse 2, chapter 5, verse 2. Right? It says, not for filthy lucre. It's not for self-gain. Not for self-gain. So that is the difference. Now, being lords over God's flock means to dominate them in order to serve oneself. All right? In order to serve oneself. For example, maybe I lord over you, right? What an example of me lording over you. I should have thought about this. All right, Yi Chung. Right, Yi Chung. The church van is quite dirty and, can you please make sure that before you go home you wash it? Because tomorrow, I'm going out. Is that lording over you?
Can be.
It can be? Really? Wow, you're so humble. How can it be and how can it not be?
If it's not, if it's for church things, but also if it's not impeding on a person's life excessively.
Mm.
Yeah.
If it's for church, why would a clean car be useful for church?
So you're driving the church now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, for example, because it has the church name on it and all that, and the pastor is unable, don't have time, and they say, please help. Because tomorrow we are going out for evangelism. We don't want the church van to look so horrible, and then people, what kind of testimony will bear? Now, that's different, right? Because ultimately we want people to have a good image of, and not have the wrong image of a church. Now, but if it is simply because I'm lazy to wash the car and there's no reason except you serve me, all right? So you're in church, right? So you're my flock. So you serve me, kind of thing. Oh, I like to eat this. All right, then I just called one of your mothers and said, I like to eat this week. Can you all please all take turn to cook this for me? Now, that's lording over God's heritage. Now, this is what God is saying. That's why filthy lucre, he said, now, do you think there are people who are like that in churches? Sadly, there are. All right, sadly, there are. And just because we are used to, conservative and sound church, some may tell you, all right, if you don't have enough money, is your problem. Make sure that you give a lot of love gift to me so that I can afford my lifestyle. And the more I get, then the richer you may get. That kind of ideas is just to promote, it's just to give them what they want to sustain their personal, carnal, fleshly desires. All right? So these are warnings. All right, warnings. Now, but you get the idea, all right? You get the idea. Taking oversight of God's flock now is to look upon. Now remember, I gave you definitions about taking oversight, and I repeated that. It's caring for, right? Caring for. Lording over, the lords does not mean lording. A lord does not necessarily mean he will care. Correct? The Lord should. But this taking oversight, this feed has to do with like a nurse caring for a sick patient, all right? So that's the caring part that is for the good of the sheep. Lording is for the good of the individual, all right? In this particular context. Now, why do you think? Question number 5. Why do you think it is important, both for the elders and congregation, to understand this difference? All right. Sorry, not in question 2, right? In question 4. In question 4. I think yours is question 4. Why do you think it's important to understand this difference? Why do you think so? Ajax, why do you think so? Why do you think it's very important for congregation to understand the difference between, is someone lording over us or is someone having oversight over us? Why do you think it's important? Skip?
Yeah.
Okay, skip, all right. JB?
fall into the traps of having a false pastor or like someone who's manipulating them?
All right, first one, well, then you make sure that you don't fall into the idea of, this is my friend, I like this friend, and then just elect them, right, and appoint them as pastors. These are examples of what the pastors and the elders should be, right? They should be selfless, they should care for the sheep, they should point the sheep to God, right, not to themselves. It's not a popularity contest all the time, right, making themselves popular, right, but point people to God. And, all right, good. What else, Aaron? Why do you think it's important for congregation to understand when someone is doing something, this is not lauding, or there's something, this is actually taking oversight? Why is it important to understand?
So that the flock serves with the right intention.
So that the flock serves with the right intention. That's, yes, true. The flock should always serve towards God, not towards the pastors and the elder. Their mentality should always, I do this for God. Yes, the pastor asked me to do this, but I'm doing this for God, right? Okay. Now, maybe I ask Ella, why do you think it's important for the flock to understand the difference between, is someone lording over us, or is someone taking oversight, caring for us?
You need to make sure that, one, that you will actually obey your pastor, I guess, or your church leaders when they're not lording over you and when they're just executing normal, healthy authority. But then also you need to know if you go to a church and there is a pastor who's misusing his authority, you need to know that that's just not what should be happening.
All right, so 2 reasons. One is so that you can discern whether the church leadership is doing what is supposed to be according to God's word. And the other one is, well, if the pastor and elders exercising healthy authority. Healthy authority meaning God's heritage means pointing you to Christ, making you more spiritual. That is a healthy authority, right? That is caring for you spiritually. Though sometimes it may be unpleasant, right? So once you are able to differentiate and you understand, then you accept, you receive that kind of authority. Now, then Elim, when you receive that kind of authority, what happens to you?
Wait, healthy?
Healthy, yes. You will grow spiritually, right? So why is it important to understand all this? You begin to realize that if the pastor and the elder is treating me like God's heritage, means they are pointing me to Christ. They are helping me to love Christ more. They are helping me to acknowledge certain sins in my life so that I get rid of them, so that I stop them, although my flesh likes them, all right? But once I understand they are treating me like God's heritage, then I embrace it as much as the flesh doesn't like it, and I will begin to grow spiritually, all right? Now, you may think that, well, that is no-brainer, all right? But when you are sitting there at the church camp, all right, then for example, the chalet lead, all right, being instructed by the rules of pastors and elders, all right, when it is time for chalet fellowship, we're not talking about recreation time. We set apart recreation time for your own recreation. It's fellowship time among the chalet, and then your chalet leaders come and exercise. The pastors and the elders' authority and say, please put away this board game, or please put away this particular game, this thing that or this toy that you're fiddling with. All right. Now, at that moment, unless you remember, all right, the elders and the pastors, the church, is to treat you as God's heritage, means help you to love Christ more, obey Him better, serve Him better, all right? You can actually, if you're not thinking according to Scriptures, get very angry. Now, so sometimes these kind of things happen, right? Because we say that there is recreation time, you can play with those things during recreation time. But when fellowship time is set apart. It is for us to interact, correct? For us to get to know one another and encourage one another. But once we are distracted from that, which is the set apart time, which is to encourage one another spiritually, then when we disobey that, at that point you must remember this, right? The church is helping you to be a better Christian to another Christian, right? Not that recreation is evil, right? Of course, certain recreation you should not be part of. So all these kind of things are to help you remember. The church, when they put certain rules, right? Don't take it as they are lording over us. They are controlling us. Even control what time we sleep, right? So some of you begin to think differently. The church is to have oversight over us as God's flock, God's heritage, to draw us closer to God. Then these rules, though my flesh don't like it, all right? But, though my flesh doesn't like it, but I realize this is helping me to be a better heritage of God. Correct? Right? So a lot of these things may seem kind of straightforward, but when you are in that situation, one day, maybe for example, all right, your dad tells you something. Your dad is also authority in your life, correct? You must always remember, I am God's heritage and daddy and mommy is helping me to be a better heritage. All right? Think that way. Think that way. So it is easy for us to group together and then begin to murmur and complain against the church. So sometimes you may be part of a conversation and then someone brings up, you know, the church wants to do this, wants to do that, and you know, all this kind of, they're lording over us. You have to think and then guide the conversation. If it is true, then approach the leaders. All right? Approach the leaders. Okay? Now, last but not least, and then we end. Right, just some examples. Right, just some examples. Give some examples. Now, actually, I gave you a few examples. Give some examples in the church where we need to differentiate between lordship and oversight. All right, and explain why they are not lording over you for personal gain. Now, what are some examples? Well, I kick off one. An example is the direction of the church in having English and Chinese congregations separated over time. Correct? That's the direction of the church. Some may not like it. Some may feel that, you know, we've been always worshiping together. We always had translation on the fly, on the pulpit. See, the pastor and the elder, they're controlling the church. They want to split the church. We don't like this. We like everyone to be together. Right? I like to listen to English and then have it translated into Mandarin. Immediately, I get to listen twice. I don't like all this. Then you begin to murmur and complain and stir others and say, you see, the church is controlling and all this. So the church direction in the recent years of moving to English and Chinese congregation separated, we explain the rationale. All right, we explain the rationale. Now, is this an example of the church lording over misdirection or taking oversight? I don't know where I am now. All right, maybe this is a bit tough. Maybe I ask, ask Abigail, what do you think? Lording over or oversight?
I think taking oversight, because if someone new comes, they might not be comfortable with it going where before.
All right, very good. It should be oversight, because if there's someone who is new, who doesn't understand Mandarin. Ella, do you understand Mandarin? No, right. Doesn't understand Mandarin. Mark? No, right? There's a Mandarin, Gracia, right? Do you understand? Right, so there are many who come over time. And we've had many who came and they realize, oh, this is kind of like difficult. I get very distracted just when I'm catching something. And then the Chinese part goes on and I get distracted and so on, right? Yes, maybe some of you may find it good, but we are in Australia. Right? We are planted here. The mission of the church is to reach out to Australians, right? And though if you are in a different country, it may be different. So is this the pastors and the board trying to exercise lordship because we want to do that? I have to preach twice. Morning and afternoon for main worship is more work, right? But some still think we are controlling the church and not giving us what we want. Remember, church means we give God what He wants, right? So like Abigail rightly pointed out, for example, right? The church began to grow. Why? Because people who only understand English, which is quite common in Australia, they begin to stay when they come, right? So we have to put aside some of these things and not say the church is overly controlling, even deciding on all these things, all right? Language issues. So just one example. Camp rules is another one I gave as an example. Right. Well, can you think of any? Actually, I can't think of. I can only think of this. Anyone? Maybe those who have been here for longer than others. I know many of you are new. Jesse, right? So kind of that. Jesse, any? No? Faith?
I don't think so either.
Okay. All right, but if you can think of any, please give us an example. Well, I think the other one is music as well, right? Music. So we do make sure that we have certain set rules. Now, rules are not necessarily lording. Rules can, when it safeguards the church. Remember I mentioned just now, there is the duty of safeguarding, protecting. When it's for protecting the church, these rules are oversight, overseeing, caring, right? So even for the music, we do specify, if you are a church pianist, for example, then there are certain forms, certain things that we do not want you to do, right? Why? Because it will introduce problems, right? The music will change and so on. So all these things, the church does set rules for the long term safety of a church. A church never goes from conservative sound music to very, very carnal, rock and roll, jazz. It doesn't go from here and jump over there, right? It's often a progressive thing. So some of the rules, so-called set in, are to protect the church. So one of the responsibilities is to protect, right? To protect. So these are examples about, well, us must not feel that this is lording. If we ask ourselves, heritage, God's heritage means we are to draw close to God, we belong to God, we are here to please God, we are here to serve God, we are here to follow God's instructions, we are to grow spiritually. Now once we begin to realize that, then we know how to differentiate between lording and taking oversight, to care and protect the church and to help you grow, right? All right, so that is what I want us to understand, both perspective, the warnings to pastors and elders, as well as the encouragements to the flock of God, all right? So God willing, when we come back the next time, we'll move on to the next topic here that is about the Christian humility. Christian humility, all right? Let's turn to God in prayer. What do we have here? Top 5 reasons why church dropouts, what church dropouts say, why they stop attending church. Now please remember 66% of, well, I take the American view, they are the most readily available results. They stop attending church at least a year after turning 18. So from